Some of you may be reading the book of Revelation for the very first time. Others of you may know it because of how contemporary interpreters have sought to unravel the mysteries of the book. But I wanted to offer a few comments about how early Christians read the book of Revelation. I think you might find that history rather interesting as you begin your own reading or rereading of the book. As you'll know from the textbook, the book of Revelation was written in the last decade of the first century of the Common Era, probably about the year 95, during the reign of the Roman Emperor Domitian. And the author of the Apocalypse attempts to portray Domitian, who was a megalomaniac and who persecuted early Christians, as a kind of resurrected Nero, a parody of the resurrection of Jesus. Domitian, as an emperor, made divine claims for himself even before his death, and earned the scorn of Christians as one who parodied or sought to imitate Christ as a sort of resurrected Nero. The era after the year 70 and the destruction of the temple was one that brought what sociologists would call a considerable amount of cognitive dissonance, both for Jews and for Christians. Jews who lived in the wake of the destruction of the temple wondered how it was that Judaism was to be organized and was to survive without the temple cultus in Jerusalem. Christians too lived with a certain amount of cognitive dissonance, insofar as the second coming had not occurred as soon as they had expected. Christians suffered persecutions both at the hands of Jews but also at the hands of the Romans, who saw Christians as a novel religion, as a despised sect. And another factor that needs to be remembered is that in the year 79 there was the devastating eruption of the volcano at Pompeii, and many people interpreted that as an apocalyptic sign. Apocalyptic fervor began to run hot again in the decade of the 80s and the early 90s in light of that eruption. When early Christians read the Apocalypse of John, and they looked at the opening chapters of that book, especially the letters to the seven churches in chapters 2 and 3, and as they read the description of the Christian seer who penned the Apocalypse, they would have seen that seer for what he was. That is, he was not a Gentile Christian convert, but rather he was a Jewish Christian convert, a Jewish follower who came to accept Jesus as the crucified and risen Messiah. He was probably a convert from Palestine, maybe Jerusalem, someone well acquainted with the temple in Jerusalem and with the workings of the temple. He was a conservative Jewish Christian. He was a Jewish Christian who would have continued to observe Jewish customs, circumcising male children who were born into the community, as well as keeping kosher dietary laws, observing the demands of the law. The author of the Apocalypse was someone who had little or no sympathy with the Apostle Paul. He considered the Apostle Paul to be a libertine. He thought that Paul's accommodation to Gentile Christians, not insisting on circumcision, not insisting on kosher dietary laws, to be an accommodation to the Roman Empire as a slippery slope, as something that ultimately would lead to all sorts of caving in to the demands of the empire and to the possibility of idolatry. So in those letters in chapters 2 and 3, when the author is warning against not accepting the teaching of the Nicolaitans, which is a made-up word, it means master of the people, or not accepting the teaching of Balaam, a word in Hebrew that means master of the people, or not accepting the teachings of Jezebel, the evil queen in the books of Kings, who taught Israel to accommodate foreign religious practices. All of those are thinly veiled, encoded criticisms of Paul and of Paul's letters. It's not an accident that this author writes letters to 7 churches in Asia Minor. They're intended to be letters, 7 of them. Remember, there are 7 authentic Pauline letters. They are intended to be letters that supersede Paul's letters, that teach a more stringent view of Christianity, that does not accommodate in any way to Roman customs and Roman practices. It's a call, a return to a more Jewish form of Christianity. First century Christians would have recognized that. And that made the Apocalypse a very controversial book. At the time it was written, but especially in the 2nd century, in the decades immediately following its publication. The Apocalypse was a hot potato in the 2nd century, hotly debated. And yet some came to admire it because the 2nd century saw continued persecutions of the church, as did the 3rd century. And so the thing that saved the Apocalypse in the 2nd and 3rd century for early Christian readers was the fact that it promised a reward for faithful witness in the face of martyrdom, that it promised a reward to the martyrs. And so when you look at its champions, who were Justin Martyr in the middle of the 2nd century, Irenaeus at the end of the 2nd century, Tertullian at the end of the 2nd century and the beginning of the 3rd century. All of them admired the Apocalypse because it talked about the importance of Christian bravery, of faithful witness in the face of persecution, and it promised a reward to the martyrs. That saved the Apocalypse. And one of the ways in which these 2nd century readers of the Apocalypse sought to preserve its authority because of what it had to say about martyrdom was to suggest that the John who authored the Apocalypse was the same John, the son of Zebedee, who authored the 4th Gospel and the Johannine epistles. So they sought to link the Apocalypse to the 4th Gospel and to the Johannine epistles. Now, many opposed that because they saw that the literary style was quite different, and they recognized that the Apocalypse of John was not an apocalyptic gospel, and that was a cause of debate. But those who admired the Apocalypse sought to undergird its authority by linking it to the 4th Gospel. An interesting thing happened as well, and that is that in linking this gospel or this Apocalypse to what it has to say about martyrdom, All of the readers in the 2nd and 3rd century knew that it criticized the Roman Empire, and so the Apocalypse was admired because it became a way in which one could criticize the ethics and moral standards of the Roman Empire by comparison to the ethics and moral standards of Christianity. But in the 4th century, things changed. What changed? Well, in the year 312, the Roman Emperor Constantine converts to Christianity. And so what do you do with a book like the Apocalypse that is so critical of the Roman Empire in general and Roman emperors in particular? And so in the 4th century, we see the Apocalypse read in a very different way. And the way in which the Christian readers of the Apocalypse in the 4th century read the book is to see all of the criticism of Babylon and this imagery about the beast, the first beast and the second beast and the mark of the beast and the like. The way in which they understood all of that symbolic language was to refer to Christian heretics, to people who taught a different understanding of salvation from the Orthodox understanding. And so they read the Apocalypse not as a critique of empire or emperor, but as a critique of heretics and of bishops who accommodated to the teaching of heretics. And they especially thought that the book spoke against those monastics in the desert of Egypt who seemed to be going their own way and rejecting the teaching of the bishops. So the Apocalypse came to be read not as a critique of empire, but as a critique of heresy. And it's also very interesting in the 4th century that Athanasius, whom you read about in the very first day of our course, he's the one who came up with the list, the first list of the 27 books of the Christian scriptures that correspond to our list. And Athanasius included in his list of Christian writings that were to be authoritative as a part of the canon, he included the book of Revelation. And one of the reasons that Athanasius included the book of Revelation is because in its final chapter, in chapter 22, it has this warning about adding to or taking away from the word of prophecy. And Athanasius considered that to be a warning not only about the prophecy contained in the book of Revelation, but a warning about adding to or subtracting from the 27 books that he considered to be authoritative. So he used the language at the end of the Apocalypse to be a kind of canonizing period or point of closure for the Christian New Testament that he was trying to recommend. So you can see when you look at the way in which early Christians read the Apocalypse, they read it first as a critique of Paul. Second, they read it as a recommendation for bravery and courage in the face of martyrdom. They read it as a critique of the Roman Empire. And finally, they read it as a critique of heresies and a way of recommending a closure for the New Testament. That's a very different way of reading the Apocalypse from what we hear at the hands of 20th and 21st century commentators. And I thought you would find that look at early Christian readings of the Apocalypse interesting.